I found out that my homeowners association was using my family farm as a parking lot without my permission. But what they didn't realize was that I controlled the power line supplying electricity to their whole community. Imagine discovering that your neighbors were relying on your land to keep their lights on. What would you do? Please share your thoughts in the comments. It was never my intention to clash with my neighbors, but that's precisely what happened one Saturday morning. I was jolted awake at 7 a.m. by the noise of engines and slamming doors. My grandfather's farmhouse has been part of this land for over 70 years, a fixture long before the new houses appeared around it. I inherited this 10-acre farm 3 years ago after my grandfather passed away. To me, it represents not just land, but my family's history, my future, and my daily joy. Still in my pajamas and robe, I rushed outside to investigate, and what I saw made my blood boil. At least 12 cars were parked neatly in my east field, the very field where I plan to plant corn next week. There was a woman in a blue blazer, looking every bit the part of someone in charge, waving additional cars into my property. She held a clipboard and wore that familiar, forced smile of authority. "What do you think you're doing?" I yelled as I made my way across the yard, my old farm dog Rusty barking beside me. The woman turned towards me, irritation evident on her face. "Good morning," she replied, her smile not reaching her eyes. "I'm Margaret Wilson, president of the Evergreen Meadows Homeowners Association." "Honestly, I don't care if you're the president of the United States," I responded, working hard to keep my voice steady. "This is private property, my property. You're trespassing." Margaret tilted her head, looking at me as if I were a child not grasping the situation. "Oh, you must be confused. This area has been designated as community overflow parking in our HOA bylaws." She glanced at her clipboard. "Are you the Davis who lives in the old farmhouse? We've been trying to contact you about joining our association." "I'm not confused at all," I shot back, pulling out my phone to show her my property deed. "This land has been in my family for generations. We're not part of your development." Margaret's perfect smile faltered. "Well, this has been designated community parking for years. The previous board must have had an arrangement with your grandfather." "My grandfather would never stand for this," I said firmly. "He taught me to respect every bit of this land." As I spoke, I could see our neighbors gathering around, watching our argument unfold. Some looked uncomfortable, while others seemed annoyed by the delay. One man in golf attire called out, "Hurry up. We're going to be late for the tournament." If you've made it this far and are enjoying the drama of these HOA stories, you're not alone. Don't miss out on the rest of the story. Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for even more shocking twists. But then I noticed something that completely shifted my focus. A large truck was backing up toward my backfield, heading straight for the tomato plants I had nurtured for weeks. "Stop that truck right now," I shouted, breaking into a run. "You're destroying my crops." The driver, noticing my frantic waving, slammed on his brakes just inches from my carefully tended rows. He rolled down his window and said, "The lady at the entrance told me to park big vehicles back here." Just then, Margaret appeared behind me, her face red with anger. "Mr. Davis, you're making a scene. We have a community golf tournament today, and this is the designated overflow area." "Who says?" I demanded. "Show me one document with my signature on it." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my cool. "According to our community bylaws, I'm not part of your community." Margaret interrupted. "You have exactly 1 hour to get these vehicles off my property before I call the sheriff to tow them at the owner's expense." Her eyes narrowed at me. "You wouldn't dare." I pulled out my phone. "Try me." She grabbed my wrist, her voice low. "Listen carefully. Evergreen Meadows is home to the mayor, 2 city council members, and Judge Reynolds. Who do you think the sheriff will side with? A bunch of respected community leaders or one stubborn farmer?" I jerked my arm away. "Take your hands off me. That's assault on top of trespassing." As more neighbors crept closer to hear our disagreement, an older gentleman stepped forward. "Margaret, maybe we should just move the cars if this is his property." "It's HOA property now," she snapped, "and you can all thank Mr. Davis here when you're late for tea time." Just then, a shiny black SUV pulled up, and a sharply dressed man stepped out. He walked straight to Margaret without acknowledging me. "Is there a problem?" he asked. Margaret's demeanor shifted instantly. She looked relieved. Perfect timing, Jeffrey. This friend of ours seems confused about the parking arrangement. Jeffrey turned to me and extended his hand. Jeffrey Williams, HOA attorney. And you are? The legal owner of the property you're all trespassing on, I replied, not taking his hand. His smile didn't waver. I understand your confusion. The easement agreement allows for community. Parking on this piece of land was established years ago, but I had never signed any easement documents. I asked for the paperwork on the spot. Let's discuss this over coffee, shall we? Jeffrey suggested smoothly. I felt tension rising. There's no need for threats, I replied, though I could feel the weight of the eyes around me, cars parked on my fields with people staring as if I was the issue. It was too much. You have 1 hour, I insisted again. Then I'm calling the sheriff, the local news, and every towing company in the county. I turned and walked back to my house, ignoring Margaret's shouts behind me. Once inside, my hands were shaking so much I struggled to dial. I contacted the county records office. This is Alex Davis from the old Miller farm outside Evergreen Meadows. I need to check if there are any easements or agreements related to my property. It's urgent. We close at noon today. The voice on the other end was friendly. Can you come by now? I glanced at the time. I'll be there in 20 minutes. As I grabbed my keys and looked out the window, I noticed things were getting worse. More cars were arriving instead of leaving, and I watched Margaret directing a pickup truck to park right next to my tomato plants. She looked back at my house with a smug expression. This had turned into a battle. When I arrived at the county records office, it was quiet, with just a couple of employees working. An older gentleman at the front desk looked up as I rushed in. I'm Alex Davis. I called about property records for the Miller farm. He nodded and introduced himself. Frank Jenkins. I've been here for 30 years. I knew your grandfather. I was caught off guard. Really? You did? Old man Miller was quite a character, Frank said with a smile. Smart as a whip, especially when it came to safeguarding his land. Frank led me into a small research room filled with filing cabinets. Your property has a fascinating history. The developers who built Evergreen Meadows tried to buy your grandfather's land for years, but he always refused. I felt a sense of pride as I replied, He certainly did. Frank nodded. They drove him crazy. At one point, they even attempted to condemn the land, claiming it was a public nuisance. My stomach tightened. This sounded all too familiar. He began pulling several thick folders from a cabinet. Let's see what we have here. Property deeds, tax records, building permits. He laid the documents on the table and put on reading glasses, ready to uncover the details. After 20 minutes of searching, Frank leaned back in his chair. Just as I thought there was no easement for parking or public access on your property, he stated firmly that there wasn't a single document showing your grandfather ever agreed to let the HOA use his land. Relief flooded over me at his words. So they're definitely trespassing, I asked. Frank confirmed it, but then he added that there was something else, a detail that piqued my interest. He pulled out a yellow document. Your grandfather granted an easement to the power company 30 years ago, he explained, allowing them to run electrical lines through the north corner of your property. I leaned in closer, confused. What does that mean exactly? He showed me a faded map. According to this, the main transformer supplying power to Evergreen Meadows sits on your land. Your grandfather arranged this when the development was built, and the power company pays $500 a year for that access. My eyes widened. Are you saying what I think you're saying? Frank's expression brightened. Exactly. The electricity for the entire HOA runs through your property, which means you control access to that transformer. I hesitated before asking, can they just move it? Frank shook his head. Not easily. It would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they'd need county approval, new permits, and your permission to terminate the current easement. My mind raced. What about those payments? I've never seen a dime from the power company. Frank quickly typed something into his computer. Payments have been going into a trust account under your grandfather's name since he passed. They've been accumulating. You should contact Pinewood Electric to update the payment information. I walked out of the records office with copies of everything, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and excitement. On my drive home, I called Pinewood Electric's emergency line. "This is Alex Davis. I own the property where transformer station E245 is located. I need to speak with someone immediately about unauthorized access to this equipment." After being transferred twice, I finally spoke with the operations manager, Ron Fletcher. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked. I explained my concern about the HOA claiming rights to my property and unauthorized access to the transformer station. "That's a serious safety issue," Ron replied. "That station serves over 200 homes in that development, and only authorized personnel should be near it." "Exactly my concern," I said. "I'll be installing security cameras today, and I'd like to know who has authorization to access the site." "Only Pinewood Electric technicians with proper ID are permitted on my property," Ron assured me. He mentioned that he could email me the maintenance schedule so I'd know when their team would be on site. By the time I reached my driveway, I had a clear plan. To my surprise, most of the cars were no longer in my field. Just 3 remained, along with deep tire tracks and crushed plants. I took a moment to assess the damage to my tomato field, snapping photos with my phone. Several plants were completely flattened, a loss representing weeks of hard work and potential income gone. Once inside my house, I printed out documents from the county office and organized them into a folder. Then I discovered the old property surveys my grandfather had kept, which showed the exact boundaries and landmarks of our land. Just as I finished, I heard a knock at my door. Standing there were Margaret and Jeffrey Williams, the HOA attorney, along with 2 others, a middle-aged man who looked serious and a young woman carrying a clipboard. "Mr. Davis," Margaret began, her tone overly pleasant, "we've brought the parking agreement for you to sign. It's just a formality, really." I paused, studying her. With the cars gone from my property and the damage done, I expected to discuss compensation for my crops. Jeffrey stepped forward, saying, "That's not how this works. The HOA board has already voted to designate this area for community use. We're simply asking for your cooperation." "And if I don't cooperate?" I asked, contemplating the situation. The serious-looking man introduced himself as Robert Thompson, a city councilman. "This community represents significant tax revenue for our city. Surely we can reach a reasonable arrangement that benefits everyone." The young woman shifted uncomfortably beside him. The environmental impact study for additional parking within Evergreen Meadows would take months. "This is really the only viable option for community events," she explained. I smiled, which seemed to surprise them. "I just came from the county records office," I said, holding up my folder. "There is no easement for parking on my property, and there never has been." Margaret waved her hand dismissively. "Old paperwork can be updated," she replied. "I've also discovered something interesting about your community's power supply," I continued, revealing the easement documents. "The transformer serving your entire neighborhood is on my land." Their expressions shifted instantly. Margaret's smile vanished, and Jeffrey straightened his tie. The councilman took a slight step back. "I'm officially revoking access for non-essential maintenance until we resolve this situation," I declared. I had already talked to Pinewood Electric about some unauthorized personnel near their equipment. "You can't do that," Margaret exclaimed, her frustration evident. "People have medical equipment in their refrigerators." I reassured her. "I'm not cutting your power. I'm just exercising my property rights, just as you are trying to do with my farm." The councilman cleared his throat. "Let's not rush into things. I'm sure we can find a solution." I agreed and calmly laid out my proposal. All vehicles must be off my property by 5 p.m. I wanted full compensation for crop damage and an acknowledgement that my land is not part of the HOA. Margaret challenged me, though her voice had softened. I held up the power easement document, stating, "I will exercise my right to deny access for the scheduled maintenance next week. With summer approaching, it would be unfortunate if the system couldn't handle the load because it couldn't be properly serviced." They quickly left, huddled together as they talked on their way to their cars. I watched from my window, feeling a mix of victory and unease. I knew that someone like Margaret wouldn't give up easily. My phone rang, and it was Ron from Pinewood Electric. "Mr. Davis, I understand there might be an access issue with transformer E245. Is everything okay? Taking a deep breath, I explained, there's been a misunderstanding with the local HOA. They believe they have rights to my property. Ron replied, concerned, that transformer is critical infrastructure. Any access issues could affect service for hundreds of homes. I understand, I said, wanting to avoid inconveniencing anyone. I just need the HOA to respect my property rights. How about this, Ron suggested. I can come out Monday morning to inspect the transformer and discuss access arrangements. Sometimes having an official presence can help clear things up. I thanked him and hung up, feeling a bit more positive. But my relief was short-lived. Through my window, I noticed Margaret's car returning, this time followed by 3 police cruisers with their lights flashing. This confrontation was far from over. It was just beginning. I watched as Margaret and her lawyer approached my porch, their smug expressions igniting my frustration. Keeping my voice steady, I said firmly, I'm not signing anything. In fact, I'm giving you 24 hours to remove all vehicles from my property and fix any damage to my fields. He leaned forward, but I simply shook my head. That's not how this works. The HOA board has already voted. I paused, pulling the easement documents from the folder I was holding. I just found something interesting about your community's power supply. Their expressions changed quickly, almost comically. Margaret's smile disappeared, and Jeffrey's confident stance faltered. That's impossible, Margaret whispered, reaching for the papers. Check for yourself, I replied. My grandfather struck this deal years ago. The power company pays me yearly for access to that transformer, the one that supplies electricity to every house in Evergreen Meadows. Jeffrey adjusted his tie, looking anxious. That doesn't change anything about the parking situation. I nodded slowly. Actually, it changes everything. I'm officially revoking access for non-essential maintenance until we sort out this parking issue. I had already contacted the power company to explain the situation. You can't do that, Margaret exclaimed, her face reddening. People have medical equipment, children, elderly residents. I'm not cutting off your power, I clarified, taking back my documents. I'm just exercising my property rights, just as you are with my farm. Funny how that works, isn't it? Before they even reached their car, I could hear Margaret yelling into her phone. Within half an hour, my phone began ringing with calls from various HOA board members. I opted not to answer any of them, and instead called the power company myself. Their legal department confirmed my rights under the easement agreement, agreeing to notify me before any non-emergency work on the transformer. By dinner time, I noticed cars disappearing from my field. I watched from the kitchen window as drivers hurried to move their vehicles, some stealing worried glances at my house. By nightfall, my property was completely clear. The next morning, I got up early to survey the aftermath. Tire tracks marred parts of my east field, crushing young plants and compacting soil I had spent months preparing. I diligently documented the damage with photos and videos. Just as I finished, I spotted Alina, my friendly neighbor from Evergreen Meadows, walking her dog along the fence line. Morning, she called out. Emergency HOA meeting last night. Never seen Margaret so angry. Curious, I walked over to chat. What happened? I asked. You've been under a lot of pressure lately, especially with the threat to cut off our power. Mr. Henderson, who used to be a lawyer, pointed out something important. If that transformer is indeed on your property, and we've been using it as a parking space without permission, we could face serious legal issues. Elena noticed the tension in the room. She mentioned that half of the board wanted to back down from the threat, while the other half, inspired by Margaret, believed it was all just a bluff. Margaret argued that no one would want to risk the negative publicity of threatening a community's power supply. Elena, looking a bit uneasy, cautioned me to be careful. She hinted that there might be other ways to deal with difficult neighbors. Grateful for her warning, I spent the rest of the morning reaching out to fencing companies to fix the areas damaged by cars. The earliest appointment I could secure was 2 weeks away. Later that afternoon, while I was going through repair estimates, I heard the sound of the mail truck. As I walked to my mailbox, I discovered a certified letter bearing the Evergreen Meadows HOA logo. Inside, it informed me that I was being fined $5,000 for so-called unauthorized landscape modifications and agricultural activities that violated community aesthetic standards. The letter also warned me that I had 72 hours to remove visible farming equipment from the roads or face additional fines of $500 per day. At the bottom, I saw Margaret's signature, accompanied by a handwritten note. Perhaps now you'll reconsider our generous parking agreement. I read that letter 3 times, my hands trembling with anger. Then I realized something odd. The letter listed my property address as part of Evergreen Meadows. I called Frank at the county records office for clarity. He confirmed they can't take action against you if you're not a member. However, he cautioned that HOAs like this can be relentless in their tactics. So what should I do next? I took his advice to document everything, install security cameras, and consider speaking with Oliver Jenkins, an attorney who specializes in challenging aggressive HOAs. He had handled a similar case in Pine Creek last year. Thanking Frank, I promptly ordered security cameras online. While checking out, I noticed an email alert. The power company had just deposited this year's easement payment into my account. An idea started to take shape in my mind. I quickly looked up Oliver Jenkins' number and left a message explaining my situation. Then I stepped outside to take a closer look at the transformer. As I walked through my property, I noticed a small green box that had previously escaped my attention. Now it seemed significant. Upon closer inspection, I saw fresh footprints in the mud around it. Someone had been here recently, and the access panel looked slightly ajar. Suddenly, Margaret shouted, pointing at me near the transformer. "That's him! He was just tampering with it." I froze, feeling anxious as she called out to the worker from the power company. My heart raced. Why was she trying to blame me? "I just got here," I said calmly to the worker. "The panel was already open. You can check the security cameras in my barn if you don't believe me." The worker, whose name tag read Dave, seemed puzzled. "Ma'am, we don't have any reports of tampering," he replied. "Check it," Margaret insisted. "He threatened to cut our power yesterday." Dave approached the transformer cautiously and examined the panel. "This has definitely been tampered with. The access lock is broken." He looked at me, suspicion in his eyes. "Sir, did you do this?" "Absolutely not," I replied firmly. "I just noticed it myself and was about to report it. My security cameras will show I've been in my house all morning until just 5 minutes ago." Margaret sneered. "Convenient that you mention cameras. Where are they? I don't see any." "They're being installed tomorrow," I admitted, but I had nothing to do with this. Then a thought struck me. "Dave, when was the last time someone from the power company checked this transformer?" "According to our records, not for at least 3 months," he said, glancing at his tablet. I turned to Margaret. "How did you know the panel was open? You drove straight here and pointed it out." Her face flushed. "I noticed it earlier," she stammered. "Or when someone you sent was breaking the lock," I suggested. Dave shifted uncomfortably between us. "I'm going to need to file a report about this," he said. "Please do," I replied. "And I'd like a copy, along with confirmation that no one from Evergreen Meadows has authorization to access this equipment." Margaret, looking frustrated, stormed back to her SUV without a word. Meanwhile, Dave spent half an hour securing the transformer and taking photos. He handed me his card and promised that his supervisor would call me that night. When Oliver Jenkins returned my call after hearing my story, he agreed to represent me. "This sounds like classic HOA overreach," he said. "They often target properties they want to control, especially ones that don't fit their mold. You might be relieved to hear that you have some power in this situation thanks to the transformer easement. After a week without any issues, I decided to take action. I filed formal complaints about people trespassing and tampering with my property. I also set up security cameras and teamed up with Oliver to draft a cease and desist letter to the Homeowners Association, HOA. Then, early on Monday morning, my alarm system alerted me at 4:30 a.m. I checked my security app and saw movement at my east fence. I could hardly believe my eyes. Someone was cutting through my recently repaired fence with bolt cutters. I immediately called the sheriff and rushed outside, recording everything on my phone. By the time I reached the fence, 3 sections had already been cut open, and a line of cars was pulling into my field. "This is private property," I yelled, still recording. "You're trespassing." The driver of the first car rolled down her window and replied, "We have permission from the HOA. Check your email if you don't believe me." One by one, each driver showed me the same email from Margaret that granted them permission to park in what they claimed was the community overflow lot on my property. The email stated that the dispute had been resolved. When Sheriff Reynolds arrived about 20 minutes later, there were already 12 cars parked on my land. He looked uneasy as I showed him the cut fence and my videos. "I'm sorry, but there's not much I can do right now," he said after talking to several drivers. The HOA had submitted documents to the county stating that this area was designated for community parking. "What documents?" I protested, showing him my property deed on my phone. He sighed, clearly torn. "This is becoming a civil matter. You've got conflicting claims and paperwork. You'll need to take it up in court. I can't just tow all these cars based on your word against the HOAs." After he left, I called Oliver. He assured me he would file for an emergency injunction that day, but I knew the courts took their time. As I paced in frustration, I decided to visit Elena. She had always been straight with me, so I hoped she might have more insights. When she invited me in for coffee, I could see the concern on her face. "I need to show you something," she said, once we were settled at her kitchen table. She pulled out her tablet and explained, "I'm on the HOA email list, and what they're doing isn't right." She opened her email and displayed several messages between Margaret, Jeffrey, and other board members. They were discussing strategies to annex the farm and applying pressure to ensure compliance. "Keep scrolling," Elena said, her voice heavy. The next email made my heart sink. It contained a scanned document that looked like my grandfather's signature on an HOA agreement from 15 years ago. "That's fake," I whispered, certain of it. "My grandfather would never have signed this." Elena glanced at the date on the document. "Look, April 2009. Your grandfather was still the owner then." "Yes, until he passed away 3 years ago. But that isn't his signature." "I've seen enough of his paperwork to know," I replied firmly. Elena nodded, her expression serious. "Margaret's husband works at a printing company. He has access to the equipment that could easily create this." She scrolled down to another email. "It gets worse. There's an emergency board meeting tonight at Senger. They have a special guest, Margaret's cousin, who works for the power company. They're discussing options to permanently resolve the transformer issue." "What does that mean?" I asked, though I was already bracing for the answer. "They're planning to reroute the electricity to bypass your property entirely. Her cousin says it's costly but feasible. If that happens, you lose a lot of your leverage." I sat back, taken aback by their determination. "Why are you showing me this? Won't you get in trouble?" Elena sighed. "I bought my house here because it backs up to your farm. I loved seeing the open fields and crops, not another cookie-cutter house. They've been trying to push out anything that doesn't fit their vision for the community for years." Just then, my phone buzzed with a text from Oliver. "Judge Henderson granted our emergency hearing tomorrow at 9 a.m. Bring all documentation." I showed Elena the message and asked, "Will you testify about these emails if needed?" She hesitated for just a moment before nodding. "Yes, this has gone too far." As I walked home, I noticed a power company truck parked near my property line. Margaret's cousin was already getting to work, and I had less than 24 hours to stop them. Back at my house, I gathered every document I could find: property deeds, easement agreements, photos of the damage, security videos, everything I thought might help. Then I made one more call to a local news station. "I have a story about HOA corruption, forged documents, and property rights," I explained to the reporter. "It all comes to a head at a public meeting tonight." My heart raced as I stood outside the crowded community center. Through the window, I could see Margaret animatedly gesturing, pointing at large photos of my farm, now marked with parking spaces and walkways. People nodded, completely taken in by her presentation. I took a deep breath, holding my folder of evidence tightly as I pushed open the door. The room fell silent the moment I stepped inside. Margaret, mid-sentence, froze, her expression caught somewhere between surprise and disbelief. "Well, look who decided to join us," she said, regaining her composure. "We were just discussing the community improvements planned for that farm you call yours." A few people chuckled, and I could feel my face heat up, but I kept walking straight to the front. "Actually, I'm glad you're all here," I said, my voice firm. "There's something you deserve to know about what your HOA leadership has been doing with your money and your trust." Margaret rushed toward me, visibly flustered. "He's trespassing! Someone call security!" An older man in the front row stood up. "Let him speak, Margaret. I want to hear what he has to say." Others nodded in support, and I noticed Margaret's perfectly crafted smile starting to falter. "Fine, you have 2 minutes," she snapped. I quickly connected my laptop to their projector. "I think you'll want to give me more than 2 minutes once you see this," I replied as the first slide came up. It displayed my property deed and a survey map highlighting clear boundaries. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "As you can see, my farm has never been part of Evergreen Meadows. I've never signed any HOA agreement." Shifting to the next slide, I revealed the forged document that Alina had uncovered, my grandfather's signature. "This is a forgery," I stated firmly. "My grandfather passed away 3 years ago, yet this document is dated just 6 months back." The room erupted in noise. Margaret lunged for my laptop, but I managed to pull it out of reach just in time. "He's making this up," she shouted, now flushed with anger. "This troublemaker has been breaking our rules since he moved in." I calmly moved to the next slide, the emails between Margaret and Jeffrey, detailing how to pressure me into compliance and make my life miserable. "These are the emails discussing a plan to harass me off my property," I explained. I clicked again, showing a message where Margaret authorized spending $30,000 of your dues for legal consultations about taking my land. An angry buzz filled the room. People stood, pointing fingers at Margaret and the board members at the front. "Where did you get those?" Jeffrey demanded, his lawyer demeanor slipping away. "That's not important," I responded. "What matters is that your leadership has been lying to you." From the back of the room, a woman stood up. "My husband and I. Last month, someone faced a $500 fine for having a vegetable garden that was too visible from the street. This sparked a lively discussion, with others sharing similar experiences, and the atmosphere in the room became increasingly charged. Margaret, clearly overwhelmed, grabbed the microphone and tried to restore order. "Everyone, please calm down. This is a complicated legal issue that you might not fully grasp. We're working for the community's best interests." As I prepared to present my final slide, which included county records about the electrical easement, I raised my voice to cut through the commotion. "One more thing you should know. The main transformer that supplies power to your entire community is located on my property. Your homes get electricity because my grandfather allowed the power company to set up their equipment on our land." The room fell silent. "Is that true?" someone finally asked. I nodded and replied, "Yes, I've confirmed it with both the county records office and the power company. I don't want to disrupt your electricity. I simply wish to run my farm peacefully." At that moment, Thomas, a gray-haired resident from the edge of the development, stood up. "I've had enough of this. Margaret, is any of this true? Have you been lying to us?" Margaret's expression turned furious as she declared, "This meeting is over. Everyone needs to leave now." But Elena, seated at the back, was not ready to let go. "Not until we get answers," she shouted. Jeffrey leaned in to speak with Margaret, but she brushed him off, declaring loudly, "I don't care about legal consequences. I've worked too hard to let some dirt farmer ruin everything." Gasps filled the room. Realizing she had crossed a line, Margaret stumbled over her words. "What I meant was," but her explanation was drowned out by shouts of frustration. Questions flew. "Have you targeted other homeowners? What else have you spent our money on? Did you really forge documents?" Desperately, Margaret grabbed her purse and moved toward the exit. "This meeting is adjourned. The board will issue a statement tomorrow." However, Thomas blocked her path. "No, Margaret. I think we need to vote right now. All in favor of suspending the current board while we investigate, raise your hands." Almost every hand shot up. Margaret's face transformed from red to purple as she protested, "You can't do this. It's against the bylaws." I interjected quietly, "Actually, your bylaws permit emergency removal of board members in cases of suspected financial impropriety. Section 8, paragraph 4. Margaret looked at me with a mix of fury and disbelief. In a moment of desperation, she reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. I made a call, speaking directly into my phone while I watched her. "Do it now," she said firmly. Just 3 seconds later, the lights went out. The emergency lights flickered on, casting strange shadows across the faces in the room. Margaret's laugh broke the tense silence. "See what happens when you challenge me? Your precious farm controls our electricity. Let's see how you like this." Her voice was suddenly interrupted by the sound of sirens in the distance. The atmosphere shifted. Panic filled the darkened room. My phone buzzed with a call from the power company. "Hello? Yes, I'm at the HOA meeting right now," I said loudly, and the room fell silent. I switched the call to speaker. "Mr. Davis, we caught someone messing with your transformer," said a woman in a blazer. "Our cameras captured everything, and the police are on their way." I watched as Margaret's face drained of color. "He's lying," she screamed, but other residents had already closed in around her, recording everything on their phones. "You tried to cut the power yourself to blame me," I said, incredulous at how far she had gone. Just then the doors burst open, and police officers came in with their flashlights. Jeffrey attempted to slip out the back, but collided with Officer Reynolds instead. Outside, local news vans were arriving. Elena had called them earlier, just in case. Fast forward 2 weeks, and I saw Margaret and Jeffrey on TV, facing charges for forgery, trespassing, and attempted vandalism. My farm had gained local notoriety as the site of the HOA Battlers' Victory Garden. The new HOA president, Thomas, approached me at my fence line. "We voted to help rebuild your damaged crops," he said. "Maybe we could work together instead of against each other." I smiled and shook his hand. "I'd like that. Sometimes good neighbors just need good fences and clear boundaries."